Let me invite you to open up your Bibles to Romans chapter 1. Romans chapter 1. It's good to see each one here this morning. We're going to be looking at, in our sermon this morning, at the idea of the righteousness of God. That is a phrase that is somewhat unique in the Bible, though it gets a lot more attention than the number of times it occurs. It really is found primarily in the book of Romans, and that's where it gets most of the attention. And it gets expounded upon and talked about in a lot of different ways, and I think misrepresented. Now, there's something about this concept, the righteousness of God, that is difficult. There's a complexity to it. And I don't want to dismiss that there is a difficulty in getting at what Paul is saying. I am on board with Peter in saying, many difficult things here. This is a difficult concept. What I don't want to do is add to the difficulty. I would like to, this morning, try to scrape away what I think is some of the confusion that's been added to the conversation. It's not that it's overly difficult, and I think it's made overly difficult by a lot of the commentary over the last maybe 1,000 years or so, or at least 600 years. And so I think if we can sort of peel back some of that and make a plain look at what Paul is saying, then we can add some clarity or at least remove some of the confusion about what God's righteousness is and how that connects to what our righteousness is, how we obtain righteousness. Of course, there in Romans chapter 1 and verse 16 is a key passage, and we're going to start by reading that. We're going to end up back there in Romans chapter 1 and verse 16 and 17 at the end of our lesson this morning. He says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. As it is written, but the righteous will live by faith." We'll come back, that translation, the righteous, most of your translations will say the just will live by faith. One of the things we're going to see is that this word righteousness and justice have a lot of overlap. In fact, it's the same word. When you see just or justice in your New Testament, you're seeing the root word that kind of goes in about 4 different English translation directions: justice, justification, just, righteous, righteousness. All those words have the same root. And so the LSB here translated, the righteous will live by faith. We'll come back to that, as I say, a little bit later in the lesson. Let's start by just thinking about what righteousness is. Dictionary definition, Merriam-Webster's, says righteousness is acting in accord with divine or moral law. Now, most of the time, I go to Merriam-Webster's looking at a religious word, expecting to just rake what they say over the coals. In this case, I think it's pretty good. Especially if we're talking about righteousness on the human plane. If we're talking about our righteousness, then I think this is pretty good. Acting in accord with divine or moral law. Is something righteous? Well, does it match up? Is it in accord with divine or moral law? Now, the only quibble I would take here is that the or moral law is superfluous. Because is it in accord with divine law? That is moral law, right? So what they're doing is suggesting there could be 2 separate considerations here, divine or moral. It's all the same. For people who truly believe in God, there is no morality outside of divine law. So you can see here the idea that righteousness, it carries the idea in this definition of sort of following a standard, following a rule, and we're comparing what we do. Is this righteous? Well, does it match up with this? This is the rule or the standard of righteousness, and what is righteous comes into accord with that. It is also the idea of being judged morally correct, all right? So there is a sort of, what commentators would call a forensic element. Forensic just kind of means that sort of court of law setting. When you come in and the evidence is put forth, righteous or unrighteous. And again, the judgment is made by asking the question, are you in accordance with this standard, right? And so then the judgment comes innocent, righteous or guilty, unrighteous. When we apply this to God, however, there comes a difficulty. When we say God's righteousness, is God acting in accord with divine or moral law? How could he do anything else? God's righteousness cannot be, it's not measured in the same way that our righteousness is. Our righteousness is measured by him. But how is his righteousness measured? Well, in a sense, you could say by him. But it is a quality. It's not something that exists outside of God and that God has brought himself into line with. You see, that for us it is. Righteousness exists, right? The rule, the divine standard exists outside of us. It does not exist outside of God. Right? God didn't come along and then look for righteousness and say, well, I think I'm going to decide I will go along with the righteous standard that is just sort of out there in the ether. Rather, what God does is come along, and like everything else in our existence, he creates it. He is the very standard, the very existence of righteousness. And so it is entirely appropriate for us to, if we're saying what is righteous, we just look to God, right? He's the standard. He's the very definition of what is righteous. And so he gives that to us through his very existence. Now, in addition to that, certainly he has revealed rules of righteousness, but if you're going through and you're reading through Leviticus, what does he tell us there in the book of Leviticus in chapter 19? But that he's written all that down so that you can be holy as I am holy. And he's not writing those down saying, hey, these are the rules I follow. No, he's saying this is who I am. When you read this, you find out who God is, and then you can be like God. Therefore, you can be holy. And I think righteous would be a good synonym with holiness, particularly in that context. Well, that sort of inherent, intrinsic quality, as I say, makes God's righteousness a little bit different. And I want to suggest to you that there's a particular way in which God's righteousness is described throughout the Old Testament that I think is worthy of some attention as we consider how his righteousness is talked about in the book of Romans. And that is the idea that God's righteousness is defined by his faithfulness, and particularly his faithfulness to his covenant. God is righteous when God does what God said he would do. And again, see, that goes back to our definition. He's acting in accord with divine or moral law. He's acting in accord with himself. When God says, I will do this, and then he does that, he's being righteous. So look at a few passages that we can see this idea from. And this is just a sampling, but I'm just trying to establish the concept. In Deuteronomy chapter 32 and verse 4, it says, the rock, his work is perfect, for all his ways are just. Now that's our word there. That word just is the word for righteous. In fact, some of your translations may say that. All his ways are just, a God of faithfulness and without injustice. Righteous and upright is he. So do you see how it's describing God? God is just. He's without injustice. He's righteous. He's a God of faithfulness. And so the idea is that that those descriptions go hand in hand, that it's saying one and the same thing, that if God is faithful, then he is just. Well, again, looking over at Psalm 96, and this concept is, I think, most often found in the Psalms, and so here's a few samples of that. In Psalm 96, the psalmist writes, before Yahweh, for he is coming to judge the earth. He will judge the world in righteousness and all the peoples in faithfulness. One of the reasons I think you can see this in the Psalms is because of the nature of Hebrew poetry, where you have a line and then you have a reflected line. And you can get a lot of biblical synonyms that way. You can get a lot of biblical antonyms. But in this case, I think you're getting a biblical synonym. He's going to judge the world in righteousness. He's going to judge the peoples in his faithfulness. And I think he's saying the same thing there in essence. And it's not that righteousness and faithfulness are identical terms. Don't get me wrong. But I think the idea is, especially when we're talking about God, that it is, as he is being true, he is being righteous. There are ways that, like if we said somebody is being true to himself, I'm going to tell you what, if somebody says that phrase, especially in the current culture, he's just being true to himself. Like righteousness is the farthest thing from my mind as far as what that guy's probably doing. But when we say God is being true to himself, that's what that means. He is being righteous. Psalm 119 and verse 138, in righteousness you have commanded your testimonies, and in exceeding faithfulness. Again, you get that reflection there of the term righteousness and faithfulness. And then finally in 143 and verse 1, O Yahweh, hear my prayer, give ear to my supplications, answer me in your faithfulness, in your righteousness. And again, I think appealing to the same quality, essentially the same quality there in God. A couple of other places, in the prophets, we see in Zechariah chapter 8 and in verse 8, it says, and I will bring them back, and they will dwell in the midst of Jerusalem, and they shall be my people, and I will be their God in truth and righteousness. And there, the word truth, the LSB has a footnote even that says faithfulness. Basically, I will be their God in faithfulness and righteousness. That these are the defining characteristics of God's relationship with Israel, his faithfulness and righteousness. Over in Isaiah chapter 11 and verse 5, we see here this being applied to Jesus, who is being described as the sort of new David, that one that would come from the root of Jesse. And so in chapter 11 and verse 5 of Isaiah, righteousness will be the belt of his loins, and faithfulness the belt about his waist. Now, that's not like two completely different belts, right? He's just saying the same thing, that this is going to be the thing that he is established by, that he is identified by, righteousness and faithfulness. All right, so as you're going through the Old Testament and you're looking at this concept of God's righteousness being defined by his faithfulness, some critics will come and say, yes, but that's not every case of God's righteousness. There are places where his righteousness is described, and that seems not entirely defined by his faithfulness. I agree. I'm not saying that every time God is righteous, it simply means he's being faithful to his covenant. What I'm trying to show is that sometimes, indeed, it does mean that. And as even the critics would acknowledge, every time he is being faithful to his covenant, he is being righteous. Right? There's other ways that he might be righteous, but this is that covenant faithfulness would be a definition of righteousness. In fact, a lot of times the critics are coming from a kind of a Reformation perspective, Protestant Reformation perspective. But even Jonathan Edwards, who is a hero of the Reformed movement, says of Nehemiah chapter 9 and verse 8, this very thing, that God's righteousness is primarily defined by his faithfulness to his people. And he says there in Nehemiah chapter 9 and verse 8, that the word faithful is found in this passage, but it's talking about the faithful servant Abraham. You have found that's Abraham's heart, faithful before you, and cut a covenant with him to give him the land of the Canaanite, the Hittite, and the Amorite, the Perizzite, the Jebusite, and the Girgashite, to give it to his seed, and you have established your promise. Now that's a description of God's faithfulness, right? You've done what you said, for you are righteous. Right? You see that connection? That's the description. How do I know God's righteous? Because he's done what he said. That's how we can know. And so he is true to himself. And so we can rely upon him. All right. So we take that idea of God's righteousness being defined by his faithfulness to his covenant, that is at least a possibility, and bring that into the book of Romans and consider how it works, if you will, in the book of Romans. Well, of course, as we already read in Romans 1 and verse 17, in it the righteousness of God is revealed. So the gospel reveals God's righteousness. Now, we're going to couple that with chapter 3 in just a moment, and I think you'll see what that means. But you can already see at least a connection to faith, because the next words are, it's revealed from faith to faith. All right, so we have this faith idea connected here with righteousness. We'll come over to chapter 3, and beginning in verse 3, in Romans 3, beginning in verse 3, it says, "What then, if some did not believe, does their unbelief abolish the faithfulness of God?" Now, we've talked about this passage before, and I believe a better translation, and I think some actually render it this way, "What then, if some were unfaithful, does their unfaithfulness abolish the faithfulness of God?" And so I believe what we're talking about is a contrast of unfaithfulness on the side of the people, but remaining faithfulness on the side of God. Well, as you continue on, of course, he says, "May it never be. Rather, let God be true and every man a liar, as it is written, that you may be justified in your words." That word justified is our righteousness word. You may be righteous, we could say, in your words, and overcome when you are judged. But if our unrighteousness demonstrates the righteousness of God, you see what he just did there? In verse 3, he's talking about our unfaithfulness and his faithfulness. Now he's talking about our unrighteousness and his righteousness. You just switch terms there almost interchangeably, saying if our unrighteousness demonstrates his righteousness, it's like our unfaithfulness demonstrates his faithfulness. What shall we say? Is it God who inflicts wrath? Is the God who inflicts wrath unrighteous? Well, coming on down then to verse 21. So we've established already in this context that we're using righteousness and faithfulness in interchangeable ways. Now in verse 21, he says, "Apart from the law, the righteousness of God has been manifested, being witnessed by the law and the prophets." All right. So let me just start here. I don't think what Paul is saying is that God's righteousness was in no way revealed in the law. I think what he's saying is it was not fully manifested in the law. It's not fully revealed. Manifested means it's completely out there, right? It's all revealed. But it was partially revealed in the law. And he says being witnessed by the prophets, all right? So the law and the prophets. So I think there's ways in which it was revealed, as I've talked about, you be holy for I am holy. But there's also ways that it is pointing to this manifestation. The law and the prophets are pointing forward and saying the revelation, that sort of manifestation of God's righteousness, they've already testified. That would be another way to translate witness here. They've testified of the coming manifestation. Even the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all those who believe, for there is no distinction. Now here's a key passage. We talked about this before. We had lessons about faithfulness, about faith meaning faithfulness, allegiance, and so forth. All right, so the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ. So if you think about verse 22, he's saying the manifestation of the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ. Is God's righteousness manifested through our faith in Jesus Christ? I don't think it is. I think, and the interpretive issue here is that the word "in" is very ambiguous and can be translated "in," it can be translated "of," and I would refer you to Marshall for maybe a more detailed analysis of that. But I think the righteousness, or rather the faithfulness of Jesus Christ would be a better translation here. So how would that change the passage? Even the righteousness of God through the faithfulness of Jesus Christ for all those who, and of course believe here can be translated faithfulness or allegiance, all those who are faithful, for there is no distinction. I think that beautifully describes that sort of reciprocal nature of faithfulness. God has been faithful to us, as Michael prayed in his prayer just a few moments ago, and through his faithfulness that culminates and is manifested in the faithfulness of Jesus Christ on the cross, he has made this possible, the things he's describing here, for all those who are faithful. Well, continuing on. For all, he says, there is no distinction. It's for everyone who's faithful, for there's no distinction. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, being justified as a gift by his grace through the redemption which is in Christ Jesus, whom God publicly displayed as a propitiation in his blood through faith. Again, whose faith? All right? He displayed him as a propitiation in his blood through faith. I believe, again, that is his faithfulness. And he goes on for a demonstration of his righteousness. Well, certainly not our righteousness that's being displayed there. His righteousness is on display. His faithfulness is on display. Because in the forbearance of God, he passed over the sins previously committed for the demonstration of his righteousness at the present time, so that he would be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. Where then is boasting? It is excluded. By what kind of law of works? No, but by law of faith. For we maintain that the man is justified, that is, that righteous word again. He is declared righteous by faith, or we might say by faithfulness, apart from works of the law. So, I think the idea here is in total harmony with that concept of God's righteousness being defined in this particular place as his faithfulness to his covenant, his faithfulness to his promise. Now, as we look at that in Romans at large, the argument as it's progressing, the argument as you go back to the beginning of chapter 3 is picking up on an argument against the failure of Jewish faithfulness. Chapter 3 starts with, well, then, what's the advantage of being? I thought we were the chosen people. What's the advantage of being a Jew? And so he says, and the implication is, here God has made promises to Abraham. He has promised he's going to bless the whole world through these special people, and they have failed. The question then is, does that mean God has failed? Absolutely not. Not only does their unfaithfulness not make God faithful, but God ended up using their unfaithfulness to manifest his faithfulness, to actually fulfill his promise. They could not conceive that, I think. And as you look over, I think that's what Paul is saying over in Romans chapter 10. Romans chapter 10, at the very moment that the Jews are questioning, they're saying, so you're saying that because we failed, God is not able to save the world through us? And Paul's going, you've got it all wrong. Your failure actually provided the opportunity for God to show his ultimate faithfulness. In Romans chapter 10, and looking there beginning in verse 3, again, describing the Jews, what he says in verse 1, my heart's desire and prayer to God for them is for their salvation, referring to the Jewish people. He says in verse 3, not knowing about the righteousness of God. What is it that they don't know about? I don't think what this means is they don't know about the sort of righteous behavior, the regulations that sort of describe the holiness of God. I don't think that's what he's talking about. But when he says they don't know about God's righteousness, they don't understand that Jesus on the cross was the manifestation of God's righteousness to his people, of God's righteousness to all his promises, that he's fulfilling everything that he ever said he would do at that moment, because they're so stuck in a paradigm that causes them to look at the cross as the failure of Jesus, the failure of yet another claimed Messiah. No. That's God's righteousness you were staring at there, and you missed it. And so, because they've rejected that culmination of God's righteousness, they continue to try to establish it on their own terms. That's what he says. And seeking to establish their own righteousness. So they've rejected the way that God has been faithful. You know, they don't even consider that faithfulness. They do not consider Jesus God's ultimate faithfulness. And so they continue in their own path, trying to establish their own righteousness. And they did not subject themselves to the righteousness of God. God shows up and he fulfills everything, and they just go, I cannot buy it. I don't see it, and I won't submit to it. I'm going to keep going my own way. But then he says this, Christ is the end of the law. And we might point out there again, a lot of your footnotes will say something like the aim or the goal. It's where the law was headed. So here are people saying, we're going to go back to the law and we're going to get our righteousness from there. And Paul's answer is, where do you think the law points you to get righteousness, to get to righteousness? It was pointing to Christ as well. He is the end. Wherever you go in Scripture, you're going to end up at Jesus if you follow it all the way to the end. For everyone, again, for everyone who is faithful, or who believes, as it will say in most of our translations. Well, so I think that as we look at that idea, that it helps us remove some of the confusion when it comes to our righteousness. All right, so there's God's righteousness. It's culminated in Christ on the cross, that faithful sacrifice for his people. So what about us? Well, our righteousness, as we think about that, I want to think first of all that we are capable of doing righteousness. And I think this is an important place to start out. In Matthew chapter 6 and verse 1, we'll look at a few passages along this line. Matthew chapter 6 and verse 1, beware, he says, of doing your righteousness. Some might say your righteous deeds, something like that, but I like this translation. Beware of doing your righteousness before men to be noticed by them. Otherwise, you have no reward with your Father who is in heaven. So here he's saying you go about doing righteousness. And of course, he's giving a warning. This is a negative connotation here. But just that idea, I think sometimes we make, righteousness sort of this disconnected quality. It's this thing that's bestowed upon us. But this is kind of concrete terminology here. Do right. I mean, that's how we could sort of like sum that up. When you go about doing the right thing, then make sure that you don't do it, essentially, you would say in this context, for the wrong reasons, for an audience. Over in Acts chapter 10, and there in verse 35, as Peter is preaching there to the interaction there with Cornelius, he says, in every nation, the one who fears him, that is, fears God, and does righteousness is welcome to him. Again, a clearer sense of the requirement of righteous activity I don't think you could find. Here's who will be accepted, is the people who fear him, and I think you could connote that with that sort of devotion, right, that reverence him, faithfulness, and do what they're supposed, people who do right, then they're going to be welcomed by him. Over in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 33, who through faith, this is as he sums up so many of the ones that he has no time to mention, those characters of faithfulness, he says, who through faith or faithfulness conquered kingdoms, performed righteousness, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions. I mean, as you're looking at these examples, in no way would anybody read any of these and think, now they're not really doing the right deeds. Christ did those deeds. And they're just getting credit for the deeds Christ did. No. He's talking about things you actually do that are righteousness. And when you do these things, you're performing righteousness. And so I think that's an important distinction. 1 John chapter 3 and verse 10, by this the children of God and the children of the devil are manifested. Everyone who does not do righteousness is not of God, as well as the one who does not love his brother. And so again, the negative connotation. But how do you know somebody's not a Christian? They're not doing right. They don't do righteousness. And so they can't be of God. That's a pretty simple equation. Again, I think so much of the religious world would say, that has nothing to do with it. What you do, it doesn't matter what you do. It only matters what Christ did. This is the separating distinction. How do we know? Are they doing right? No, they're not. Well, then they're not a God. That's pretty simple way to boil that down. Over in Revelation chapter 22 and verse 11, at the close of the final book that God has revealed to his people, he said to me, "Do not seal up the words of this prophecy, for the time is near. Let the one who does unrighteousness still do unrighteousness, and the one who is filthy still be filthy, and the one who is righteous still do righteousness, and the one who is holy still keep himself holy." What do unrighteous people do? They do unrighteous things. What do righteous people do? They do righteous things. It's not just, that this one has been granted a sort of, he's been deemed righteous in spite of everything he does, and this one's been deemed righteous in accordance with his works. No, it sounds like the righteous and unrighteous descriptors go along with the activity that person is actually engaged in, right? So this is not some gifted description, but rather it is an accurate description of what someone's behavior is like. Now, lest anyone think that I think we can establish our own righteousness, I want to start here. Even when we are behaving righteously, we could not even claim that for our own entirely. And I think this goes back to what Marshall was saying in the Psalms, that he is the God of my righteousness. He is my righteousness. Why? It goes back to that first definition. What standards are we coming into compliance with? Not our own. We're coming in compliance with him. We're in accord with what he has said. Who came up with that? Well, not me. And so I'm looking to him. So even when I do that, I can't just take credit and say, yeah, I thought of that myself. No, I didn't. I would have never come to these conclusions. I would have never found this but for him. He's the one who is the standard of righteousness. So even in our righteous behavior, we have no room to boast if we are as thoughtful as we ought to be. But there's another element here. Righteousness can be considered in relative terms. In Genesis chapter 38 and verse 26, Genesis chapter 38 and verse 26, Judah, in the occasion of Judah and Tamar, you perhaps remember where Tamar is married to Judah's son who dies. She is given to another one of Judah's sons who does not fulfill his obligations as the brother who takes the wife of his dead brother. He does not fulfill his obligations. He is killed. The next one is killed. Judah promises a son to Tamar, does not give that son to Tamar, and then Tamar contrives, through feigning to be a prostitute, she contrives an opportunity to lay with Judah himself and bear children from Judah, and so that she is not barren. After all of that plays out, the conclusion, Judah says, it says he recognized these elements that were given to him, these signs of who she was, and says, she is more righteous than I, inasmuch as I did not give her my son, Shelah. And he did not know her again. Now, a couple of things about that. First of all is the comparative. He's not saying she's the most righteous woman who ever lived, but he was ready to condemn her as unrighteous. And she had been unrighteous in what she did and the way that she went about that. That's not at dispute. But he's about to condemn her as unrighteous, but when he sees what actually happened, he goes, no, I'm the one who's even more unrighteous. From a comparative analysis, I've been much worse than she had. But also notice why. Because I did not do what I said I would do. You say, I didn't stay true to my promise. That is an element even for us of righteousness, that we do what we say. And so I think that's the descriptor he uses here of his own unrighteousness. Over in 1 Samuel chapter 24 and in verse 17, 1 Samuel 24 and verse 17, Saul says to David, he says, you are more righteous than I, for you have dealt well with me, while I have dealt evil with you. Now, in this particular place, you might say, this is a bit of an understatement, Saul, that David has been more righteous than you. Really, what we could say, in literal terms, David has been righteous and you have been unrighteous. And ultimately, he does say that. You've treated me well, I've treated you with evil. But you see, again, what he said, you're better than I am. Incidentally, isn't that exactly what God said when he told Samuel to go find David? I found someone who's better than Saul. So he is, in real terms, more righteous than Saul is. And again, that's not some gifted status to David. It's not David's just as bad as Saul, but he's got Jesus. No, he's actually behaving better than Saul is behaving. And so I think that's important to note there. Over in Jeremiah chapter 3 and in verse 11, here it says, Yahweh has said to me, faithless Israel has proved herself more righteous than treacherous Judah. Again, two things going on here. Number one, again, we've got a comparison. This does not mean Israel's good. It just means as bad as they were, here's Judah receiving this prophecy from Jeremiah, and Jeremiah's going, you know those people that you saw get taken away by the Assyrians? You're even worse. That's the idea. But also, again, notice the connection, faithless Israel. Even though she's faithless, she's better than you who are truly treacherous, which means even more faithless, right? You are more treasonous than Israel was before you. Finally, over in Matthew chapter 5 and in verse 20, you remember there where Jesus says that your righteousness must surpass that of the scribes and Pharisees, or you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. There is a righteousness of the Pharisees. Now, ultimately, we see not only in this context, but more specifically, maybe over in Matthew chapter 23, that the righteousness of the Pharisees is not something to be looked up to at any rate. But that's the whole point, that they have established their own righteousness. And if you live up to it, it will not be enough. And he doesn't say, you don't have to match up to their overly high standard of righteousness. No, he says, you got to do better than that. You got to exceed the righteousness of the Pharisees. So, all of that to say, we have responsibilities when it comes to this relationship of righteousness. But, having said all of that, we can do righteousness, but we can only be pronounced righteous as a gift. Ultimately, if God is going to say, this is my righteous, in the end, judged righteous servant, innocent, completely righteous, that can only come as a gift. And it can only come as a gift for multiple reasons. First of all, Romans chapter 3 and verse 24 tells us being justified as a gift, right? Justified basically means pronounced righteous, right? Found righteous as a gift by his grace through the redemption which is in Christ Jesus. We need that pronunciation that we cannot earn. We cannot stand before God and say, God, just take me as I am. If I'm innocent, I'm innocent. If I'm guilty, I'm guilty. At no way can we come in like that and hope to find a pronouncement of righteousness. Because, first of all, we've been unrighteous. So, our court of law system, I think, fools us sometimes, fools people mentally. Because what happens in a court of law is you go in and you are being accused of a specific crime at a specific moment, right? You never go into a court of law and the charge is this guy's a real jerk, right? You go in and they say, he did this. and then we consider the evidence, and the only question is he guilty or innocent of this specific thing? And there's a number of times you've seen trials go all the way to the end, and they get acquitted and pronounced innocent. And what you know is, well, they may have been innocent of that thing, but they are a guilty person, right? Horrible person, but probably didn't commit that particular crime. Well, when we stand before God, it will not be that we are standing for some specific crime that we may or may not have done. It will be our whole lives on judgment. You see, when you come into a court of law, you can say, hey, you're bringing something that's irrelevant up. You're talking about something I did 20 years ago, and that's got no bearing on this case right now. And the judge will say, sustained, and we're going to throw that out. You can't do that. Everything's on the table. And guess what? More is on the table than the DA has access to. Because God knows not just what is seen, but he knows what you've done in the dark and secret. He even knows your very heart. And so that even your motives are on trial. Everything. No one will stand innocent in that moment. And so I think as we read down through Romans chapter 3, and beginning in verse 9, going down through verse 18, and we see all of these descriptions of the person who is rebellious against God, you at some place and at some time must find yourself there. I belong in those descriptions at some place. I have been the one who is unrighteous. It will not be hard. God's not going to have to dig deep to find a place that says, here, you are guilty. You are unfaithful. You are unrighteous. So if we're going to be pronounced righteous, there's no way I can say, maybe I could say at some point, from here on, yeah, well, but what about this? You can't do anything about it. So that's the one element in which we need his pronunciation as a gift. But can I suggest to you the other element is that even in our righteousness, even when we are being righteous, that it does not bring us up to a level with God. In Luke chapter 17 and verse 10, it says, in this way you also, when you do all the things which are commanded of you, say, we are unworthy slaves. We have done only that which we ought to have done. When you read that, what do you think? I think about that in connection with some of the ideas of sort of merit-based, perfect righteousness, perfect law-keeping, and so forth. And here, Jesus blasts even that away. Even if you did it, then what? Now, what we usually say, if you kept the law perfectly, you would be righteous. I think there's a sense in which even if you actually keep all of the rules, you still are not on a level with God. I think the idea then is this, that God is righteous in a way that we are utterly incapable of being. I don't mean that we are not capable of doing what he says, that we are not capable of being obedient. But it is like the obedience of a little child. When you tell a child to do something, you understand that there's distinctions in what you're able to do and what he's able to do. You understand that you're able to provide more for him than he's able to provide for you. And so if I get home and I say, hey, let's carry in some firewood, and I carry 20 pieces of wood, and Rylant brings in his one piece of wood, I consider him faithful and obedient. But I do not consider him on an equal plane of what we are providing for each other. You see, he could never do for me what I am doing for him. And I think about our limitations of knowledge and capacity. When we do justice, I think about this, you go through and you see what God does to tell us how to accomplish justice and judgment and so forth, and 2 or 3 witnesses, and we're able to gather information, but we're going to be limited at the end of the day. And I think there's a very real possibility and a God-acknowledged possibility that you and I, as we're making decisions, might, for instance, let a guilty party go free. And God says, I won't hold you accountable. I don't think he will hold us accountable for that. We haven't sinned if we've been faithful to him, and in being faithful to him, someone still is able to go free. It's because of our limited capacity. You see, what we are able to do is be faithful servants, obedient servants, but limited. That is not what God has been to us. He has no limits. His faithfulness has no limits. His righteousness has no limits. And so I think in addition to the fact that we need forgiveness of all of our sins, we also need someone who accepts our limited righteousness and says, I will accept it on par. I will bring it, I will accept it, I will forgive whatever failures, sins where they are committed, confessed, and repented of, failures from not failures, but limitations that are recognized. And this is, I think, one of the things that we see in that sort of Jewish arrogance. You know, what do you do with somebody who has limited capabilities but doesn't know it? And walks around with their chest puffed out like they are as big and as profitable and as good as the... You're not on par with the master. And so God humbles those people. But how does he do that? It's not unjust. It's not God just saying, well, you know, he's like a kind old grandfather who's going to overlook all the deficiencies. Rather, he says, here's what I'll do. I recognize that it is short. I recognize that your sins are real and they separate you from me and they deserve punishment. You are unrighteous, and unrighteousness cannot be in the presence of God. And so, he essentially says, I will pay for it. In verse 24 again, being justified as a gift by his grace through the redemption which is in Jesus Christ, whom God publicly displayed as a propitiation in his blood through faith for a demonstration of his righteousness, because in the forbearance of God he passed over sins previously committed, for the demonstration of his righteousness at the present time, so that he would be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. There's no injustice in God in his forgiveness. Why? Because he is the justifier. He is the one who makes righteous. How? Through Jesus Christ. Specifically, through the faithfulness of Jesus Christ on the cross. That's what he's talking about. A public display of propitiation in his blood through faith. Not his righteous life, the activities of his righteous life, somehow miraculously applied and pasted over your life, but rather, here you are living a righteous life, but you have unrighteousness. And he says, I will consider your righteousness, and Jesus will pay for all of the unrighteousness. And I think that's where we end up back at Romans chapter 1 and verse 17. Romans chapter 1 and verse 17. The righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, but the righteous will live by faith. Look over at Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 36, where this passage from Hosea is also, Habakkuk, not Hosea, from Habakkuk chapter 2. It's quoted again in Hebrews chapter 10. In verse 36, it says, you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive the promise. Right? What is it you've got to? You got to do the will of God, so you may receive the promise. For yet in a very little while, he who is coming will come and will not delay, but my righteous one, that one I've declared righteous, he will live by faithfulness. If he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. But we are not of those who shrink back to destruction, but of those who have faith or faithfulness to the preserving of the soul. We're going to keep at it. We're going to stay true so that we don't lose the thing that has been promised. We don't lose the righteousness of God. When God pronounces us righteous, righteous, he is not saying to us, you are wholly unrighteous, but I will pronounce you righteous anyway. What he is saying is to a people who have decided, I'm going to be righteous. And God has said, I will accept that, and I will pronounce you righteous. Even though your efforts are not perfect, and even though you have unrighteousness on your record, but it is the result of the person who says, I will live in faithfulness. I will live in righteousness. And so we do bring we bring righteous deeds, righteousness to the table. But it is insufficient. And it will not make us pronounced righteous. We are helpless to do that. We are helpless even to know what righteousness is without him. And so, in so many ways, it is completely appropriate to say, God is my righteousness. That Jesus is my righteousness. He is the source of it in a number of different facets, but not in the way that says my activities are not under consideration, only his. That is never the case. It is always a question of, who is this for? The people who are willing to do right. When he comes, when he gets here, are you righteous? That will be the question. And that is the beauty and the tremendous graciousness here. Is it will not be a life considered and say, let me look at your whole life and see if on the whole you've been faithful. Were you faithful when the master showed up? Now that brings up all sorts of questions of, is that unfair and so forth. Those are addressed. None of it's fair, if you want to look at it that way. But from the standpoint of what God has said he would do, he is righteous and faithful to his promises. And he says they are for the people who will be righteous and faithful to him. Is that you this morning? Do you want to be righteous? It will not be given to you in spite of yourself. It'll be given to you because you make a decision and that you choose to maintain that decision until the day he comes. If there's anybody who needs to make that choice this morning, we can help you in that in any way. Why don't you come forward while we stand and while we sing.